Right, flows and flows of energy and matter. So ecosystems are linked by energy and matter flows. As we've talked about, we have different storages of both matter and energy, and then flows between those different storages. The sun's energy is going to be the main driver of these flows, and then humans can also impact the flows of energy on a local or a global scale. So solar radiation, again, just insolation enters the Earth atmosphere, and then has kind of different options, right? Some of it actually gets absorbed by the Earth or used by plants. Other amounts of sunlight will actually be reflected back into the atmosphere, as you can see here, reflected by clouds, maybe reflected from the Earth's surface, especially snowy surfaces, etc. So about 31% of the incoming solar radiation is reflected. The other 69% is absorbed. Maybe it's absorbed by the land or water. Maybe it's absorbed by molecules or dust in the atmosphere or by clouds. These kind of vary and change, and you don't need to memorize the specific percentages, but you should know that some sunlight is reflected, some of it is absorbed. So once energy or sunlight hits an ecosystem, it has kind of a couple different options. It could be converted into chemical energy. This, of course, happens during photosynthesis. It could transfer from one trophic level to another. So as consumers eat plants or as they eat other consumers, that will transfer energy through the trophic level. It could be basically transformed into heat energy. So as the sun warms the Earth actually releases infrared radiation, which is also known as heat. So that radiation will re-emit back into space, which is what we actually see right here, the re-radiation of heat energy. The conversion of energy into biomass over a given period of time is productivity. So productivity is a rate, it's always going to be over time. Productivity is really measuring that change in biomass or the change in energy over time. So if you're a plant, how much have you actually grown? If you're an insect, how much have you grown or how much have you reproduced, etc. Net primary productivity is going to be calculated from the gross productivity subtracting the respiration. So again, respiration is an example of our 10% rule, where a huge percentage of energy is actually going to be lost from the ecosystem through respiration and other processes. A little bit different depending on which trophic level you're at. So plants will only lose about 60% of their gross productivity to respiration, whereas animals and consumers tend to lose even more because we're kind of moving around a lot more. Gross secondary productivity is going to be the energy or biomass assimilated by consumers. Assimilated is a fancy word meaning it basically becomes part of your body. Your body will change that food into energy that it can use, either energy to move around, to breathe, to respire, or energy actually to create new cells, new material, etc. But since it's only the biomass assimilated, we're going to subtract fecal loss because the rabbit's going to eat all this food. Some of the food actually just becomes feces and is never absorbed by the body. So that's why we subtract the feces from the food intake. And then, of course, we're going to calculate net productivity the same way, where we take our gross product and then we subtract respiration from it. So this net productivity would be basically how much the rabbit itself actually grows. So maximum sustainable yields, we're going to cover way more in depth next year when we look at aquaculture and fisheries. But basically, this is another word for the productivity of a system, how much your system is growing over time. So yield is going to be a fancy word for harvesting matter. Yield is actually taking things from the environment. So we could cut down trees and that would be our yield of tree biomass. We could actually hunt animals and that would be our yield of animals, or we could fish and then we could have a yield of fish biomass. So that yield is what we're literally taking. So basically the idea of maximum sustainable yield is that if you take more than is available in the ecosystem, you're going to start depleting the resource. And we'll cover this much more in depth next year when we look at aquatic systems. Let's see, just another example. I wouldn't worry too much about this on the exam. again, because we'll be going way more in depth. And same for the carbon and nitrogen cycles. These kind of fit more into climate change. So we kind of look at the carbon cycle way more in climate change. But you might notice that carbon is transferred like a flow, it can move or it can transform, be changed. Just some more information about the carbon and nitrogen cycles, which we will cover in much more detail this year, but feel free just to look. And then some example style questions. You might analyze quantitative models of flows and energy. So maybe this would ask, what's the largest percentage or type of energy used? You would say most of it's actually carbon-based. What is the major end use? What's the smallest end use, etc. Smallest would be storage. This is like batteries, of course, storing energy for later use. You might construct a quantitative model of the flows of energy from given data. So sort of like we practice with making that ecological pyramid, showing how energy might flow through an ecosystem if they give you ecological data. And then you might look at ecological pyramids and note how different trophic levels change, right? So if you look at the number of individuals, there's lots of individuals of plants in a grassland, where few individuals of trees in a forest, just because one's way more numerous. But then you might consider how the biomass would change in a grassland versus in a forest. You might also be asked to calculate values of GPP and NPP from given data. So if they give you, say, GPP and respiration, you should try to calculate NPP from that information. Just a little video if you're interested. Again, the link to this slideshow will be in the description. So if you'd like more information, you can find it there.